The prairie sun bled orange over the horizon, setting the sky aflame in streaks of crimson and gold. The rancher stood on the porch of his weather-beaten homestead, boots planted firmly on the warped wood, eyes scanning the far fields. He had lived long enough on this land to know when something was wrong. Tonight the silence was unnatural. Not the usual kind of quiet, the peaceful hush before nightfall when the cicadas would rise and coyotes begin their song, but a hollow stillness, the kind that made the skin prickle on the back of his neck. Earlier that day he had noticed the first sign. A burned post at the north fence, charred black and still warm when his hand brushed against it. He thought maybe lightning had struck it, but the sky had been clear. No, this was deliberate, and worse than that, nailed into the post was a scrap of tattered cloth, marked with a crude symbol drawn in blood, a jagged circle with 3 slashes across it. He didn't need to ask what it meant. He'd seen it before years back in towns that no longer stood. Behind him the woman stirred. She had been resting fitfully on the old cot inside, still weak from her long run across the Badlands. When she stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned beneath her light weight. Her face was pale in the dim glow, but her eyes were wide, alert, scanning the horizon as if she already knew what he had found. "You saw it too," she whispered. The rancher nodded once, slowly. "They're marking territory. First it's the fences, then the herds, then the homes." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering even though the night air was warm. "That symbol belongs to the black vultures. They don't stop until every living soul is gone. They'll kill us all." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked like a child lost in the dark. But the rancher could tell she wasn't exaggerating. He'd heard stories of the vultures, how they swept across frontier settlements like locusts, leaving ash where barns once stood, bones where cattle once grazed. And though he'd buried his past, he had seen enough blood to know she spoke truth. They walked the fence line together, lantern swinging in his hand, shadows jumping across the dry grass. Another 100 yards out they found more signs. 2 calves lay dead by the water trough, their throats slit and bodies left to rot in the dirt. The stench was already souring the air. A crude note was pinned to one of their hides with a hunting knife. "Run, and maybe we let you live." The rancher pulled the knife free, staring at the blade. It was rusted and jagged, but the edge had been sharpened just enough to cut deep. He clenched his jaw and drove it into the dirt beside the trough. The woman stood silently, hands trembling against her skirts, but her eyes were steady. She had seen this before too. When they circled back toward the barn, the rancher noticed something else. Smoke on the horizon. Not the thin, lazy kind from a campfire, but the heavy black column of a building burning. He felt his gut tighten. "That's Miller's land," he muttered. 2 miles east, the woman's face went pale. "Then they've already started." The rancher stood for a long moment, jaw working, fists clenching at his sides. Every instinct told him to saddle his horse, ride fast, and get as far away from this cursed patch of earth as he could. But another instinct, a harder, deeper one, anchored his boots to the ground. This was his land. He had bled for it, starved for it, built it board by board with his own 2 hands. He couldn't just leave it to burn. Still, fear gnawed at him. His hands shook when he lit another lantern, the flame sputtering as it caught. The woman noticed and laid a hand gently on his wrist. "You've faced them before, haven't you?" she asked softly. His eyes darted to hers, sharp as a blade. But after a moment the hardness melted. He looked away, toward the endless stretch of prairie. "Not them. Others like them." Her lips parted as if to press him, but she stopped. She could see the ghosts moving in his eyes, shadows from another lifetime. They spent the next hours circling the property. The rancher inspected the barn, the stable, the windmill. He found tracks leading up the ridge. Horseshoes, at least 6 different sets, heavy with mud. He crouched low, fingers brushing the prints, and a cold sweat broke over him. The riders had been there within the last few hours, watching, waiting. The woman drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They're toying with us. Like wolves before the kill." He grunted in agreement but said nothing. Words wouldn't change the truth of it. By the time they returned to the house, the moon was high and the land gleamed silver under its pale light. The rancher set the lantern by the door and leaned his rifle against the frame. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but he knew the gang was closing in. The burned fence post, the dead calves, the smoke on the horizon, these weren't warnings. They were promises. Inside, the woman sat at the table, staring at her hands. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You can't face them alone." The rancher lowered himself into the chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight. "Ain't got much choice." "There's always a choice," she said, eyes meeting his. "But if you run, they'll hunt you down. If you hide, they'll burn you out. If you fight—" She paused, swallowing hard. "If you fight, at least you have a chance." He rubbed his palms over his face, dragging down over his beard. For the first time in years, he felt the cold edge of dread crawl up his spine. His body remembered the weight of battle, the deafening crack of gunfire, the stink of blood and smoke, and it remembered the cost. Loved ones lost, towns burned, graves dug shallow in dry earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. "Then we fight," the woman exhaled, as though she'd been holding her breath all night. For the first time, a flicker of hope lit her eyes. But when she reached for his hand, she felt it trembling beneath hers. The rancher wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing to face his own fear, and the signs scattered across the prairie promised only one thing. The storm was coming. The night pressed heavy against the windows, and the ranch house creaked in the wind like an old ship at sea. The lantern on the table sputtered, casting jagged shadows along the walls. The woman sat across from the rancher, her eyes fixed on him with a quiet intensity. He had just said the word she had been waiting for, "Then we fight," but she could tell the promise sat uneasy in his chest. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw tight, as though he had forced the words out against the weight of something unbearable. She leaned forward, voice soft but unyielding. "You've fought before. I can see it in you. The way you move, the way you look at the dark like it's hiding faces you've known." The rancher said nothing. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping against the rough wood, a steady rhythm betraying his nerves. His other hand hovered near the rifle, leaning against the wall, as though afraid it might vanish if he let it stray too far. The silence stretched between them until finally she whispered, "What happened to you?" He looked at her then, eyes shadowed but sharp like steel worn down by years of use. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he leaned back in his chair, exhaled a slow, heavy breath, and let the past slip free. "Before this land, before this ranch, I was a different man," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "I rode with a badge once, deputy marshal out in Red Butte. Thought I was bringing law to the frontier, thought a gun and a star made me something righteous." His hand curled into a fist on the table. "But I was young and proud, too quick to draw, too eager to prove myself. Every outlaw I cut down, I thought it meant something, like I was fixing the world with each body I left in the dust. But all I was doing was digging graves." The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected he was more than a simple rancher. The way he handled himself, the scars she had glimpsed along his arms and shoulders, the restless way he slept, these were not the marks of a man who had lived a quiet life. He continued, voice thickening. "There was a gang, mean bastards, worse than most. The Navarro brothers. They made the Black Vultures look like spoiled children. Killed a family in Carson's Crossing for nothing more than a mule and a jug of whiskey. I swore I'd bring them down. Swore it to their faces even. And when I finally tracked them to White Hollow, I didn't just bring the law, I brought hell." The lantern light flickered, shadows trembling across his weathered face. "We went in shooting. My marshal, 3 deputies, and me. By the time the smoke cleared, the whole town was burning. The Navarro brothers were dead, sure, but so were half the townsfolk. A bullet don't care who it finds, and fire don't either. I buried more innocents than outlaws that day." His hands shook as he spoke, though he tried to hide it by clenching them into fists. "After that, I threw the badge in the dirt. Walked away. Told myself I'd never raise my gun again unless it was for my own land, my own herd. But truth is," he trailed off, staring at the lantern flame, "truth is, I wasn't afraid of killing. I was afraid of what it turned me into." The woman sat in silence, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. She understood now why his hands trembled when he cleaned his rifle, why he stared so long into the distance when the night grew still. He wasn't just afraid of the Black Vultures, he was afraid of himself. "They'll kill us whether you fight or not," she said finally, her voice trembling but determined. "I've seen it. I've seen what they do to women, to children. There's no running from them, no hiding. You can either stand, or you can die on your knees." Her words struck him like the crack of a whip. He flinched but didn't argue. Deep down he knew she was right. You think I don't know fear? She pressed on, her eyes bright with tears. I ran for days with nothing but hope to carry me. I watched them burn the town I grew up in. I buried my brother with my own hands before I ran. Fear has been my only companion. But it didn't stop me from coming here, and it shouldn't stop you. Her voice broke on the last word, but her gaze never faltered. The rancher bowed his head, elbows braced on the table, hands pressed to his temples. He didn't weep. He had long forgotten how, but his whole body trembled under the weight of memory and the force of her words. When he finally lifted his gaze, the woman saw something different in his eyes. Not resolve, not yet, but the glimmer of a man standing at the edge of a choice you don't understand, he said hoarsely. When I fight, people die, and not just the ones who deserve it. Then learn from it, she snapped, her voice cutting through the silence. Don't let it happen again. Use what you know, what you've lived, and turn it against them. You think fear makes you weak? It doesn't. It makes you careful. It makes you human. That's more than those devils out there can say. Her words lingered in the air like the echo of a gunshot. Neither of them spoke for a long while after. The rancher rose, took his rifle, and stepped out onto the porch. The woman followed, silent but steady. The prairie stretched before them, endless and dark under a silver moon. Somewhere in the distance a coyote cried, and faintly, so faintly they almost doubted their ears. They thought they heard laughter on the wind. The rancher's hand gripped the rifle tight, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and let the memories of White Hollow wash over him one last time. Then he whispered, as though to himself, "If I'm to fight, it won't be for badges or pride this time. It'll be for something that matters." The woman placed her hand lightly on his arm. "Then fight for the living. Fight for tomorrow." He nodded once, slow and deliberate, and for the first time since she had arrived, his shoulders seemed to straighten. The past would never leave him, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to own him. And in the distance, across the rolling plains, a faint glow began to rise. Another ranch set aflame. Another warning. Another promise. The past haunted him, but the future was closing in fast. Dawn came with no birdsong. The prairie was hushed, as though even the sparrows had taken flight from what was coming. The rancher stepped out into the cold morning air, boots sinking into dew-soaked earth. His eyes swept the horizon, empty for now, but he knew better than to trust the silence. The black vultures were circling, maybe not within sight yet, but close enough for their shadow to stretch across his land. The woman followed him out, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. She looked smaller out here, dwarfed by the endless expanse of grass and sky, but her eyes were fierce. She carried a purpose with her now, something the night's confessions had carved deep inside. "What do we do first?" she asked. The rancher didn't answer right away. He knelt by the porch steps, ran his fingers along the boards, and checked the nails. Then he stood, slow and steady, and looked over his land. The barn, the stable, the fields, the long dirt path leading to the main road. Every corner of it was etched into his memory. This was his kingdom, his burden, and if the vultures wanted it, they'd have to bleed for it. "First," he said at last, "we shore up the weak spots." He led her to the barn, the largest structure besides the house. Its doors sagged on rusted hinges, the wood splintered in places where weather and time had worn it down. The rancher ran his hand over the grain, thinking of all the winters he'd sheltered cattle here, all the storms it had endured. Now it would have to endure fire and lead. He fetched a hammer, nails, and planks from the tool shed. Together they worked to patch the gaps. The woman was clumsy with the hammer at first, but she gritted her teeth and swung until the nails sank flush. Sweat streaked her brow, and when her arms tired, she set her jaw and kept swinging anyway. The rancher paused to watch her. There was grit in her, more than he expected. She caught his gaze, straightened her shoulders, and said, "Don't look at me like I'm fragile. I've buried more family than I can count. I won't break from swinging a hammer." He nodded once and said nothing more, but a small ember of respect burned in his chest. When the barn was as secure as it could be, he fetched his rifle from where it leaned against the porch. He ran a cloth along the barrel, checked the chamber, and worked the lever with practiced ease. His hand still shook, but the weapon felt like an extension of his arm, familiar despite the years. The woman watched him. "That rifle's not just for hunting, is it?" He didn't look up. Never was. By midday the sun baked the ground hard, but the rancher pressed on. He led her to the open stretch between the barn and the fields. a natural path raiders would take. Here he dug shallow pits, lined them with sharpened stakes cut from spare lumber, and covered them with loose brush. The woman stared at the crude traps, her face pale. That'll kill a man. That's the idea. He said it flat, without pride or shame. She hesitated, then bent down and helped gather brush. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she forced herself to keep moving. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to lay snares for men. The rancher gave a dry, bitter chuckle. Land makes killers of us all one way or another. When the traps were finished, they circled to the back of the house. There he set up hidden firing lines, rocks stacked for cover, barrels tipped on their sides to shield a crouching figure. The woman watched closely, mimicking his movements, and when he handed her the spare revolver, she took it without flinching. "You ever fired one of these?" he asked. She turned the gun in her hand, weighed it, then leveled it at the horizon. "No, but I'll learn." As the sun dipped westward, the rancher saddled his horse. "I need to warn the others," he said. "Miller's place is already ash. If the vultures are coming, they'll sweep across the whole valley." The woman touched his arm. "You're not going alone." He wanted to argue, but the steel in her eyes silenced him. Together they rode east. The land was eerily still. No wagons on the road, no cattle in the fields. Smoke still curled from the blackened ruins of Miller's ranch. The smell of charred wood and flesh heavy in the air. The woman covered her mouth, tears shining in her eyes. They pressed on to the Johnson homestead a mile farther. The Johnsons, an older couple with 2 grown sons, listened as the rancher spoke, their faces drawn tight with fear. "We can't fight them," Old Man Johnson said, voice trembling. "You've seen what they do." "You can't outrun 'em either," the rancher replied. "Best you stand and fight," but Johnson only shook his head. "I've buried too many already. We'll pack what we can and ride for Fort Bridger. Maybe the army'll do what we can't." The rancher didn't argue. He saw the defeat in their eyes, the way their hands shook as they gathered their things. Fear had already claimed them. He and the woman rode back in silence. The rancher's jaw was clenched tight, his thoughts bitter. When it comes down to it, folks save their own hides. Always have. Always will. Back at the ranch, the woman helped him haul barrels of water closer to the house, precautions against fire. Her skirts were torn and stained. Her hands blistered from work, but she never slowed. As night fell, they sat on the porch, watching the horizon darken. The rancher cleaned his revolver in silence, the lantern glow flickering across his face. His hands trembled again, the cloth slipping against the barrel. The woman saw it. She set her own pistol on the table and leaned forward. "You're shaking." He didn't answer. "You're not the only one who's afraid," she said, her voice sharp. "But I won't let fear chain me. I won't run again. And if I have to fight until my last breath, then so be it. Can you say the same?" The rancher's jaw worked. He wanted to snap back, to silence her words, but instead he sat there staring at his trembling hands. Finally, he whispered, "I can try." They spent the rest of the night setting the last defenses, oil lanterns placed along the fence line, ropes stretched low across the path to trip riders in the dark. By the time they finished, the moon was high, silver light glinting on the steel of their weapons. The rancher stood by the fence, staring into the distance. The land stretched quiet and endless, but he felt it in his bones. The storm was gathering. Beside him, the woman loaded the revolver with careful, shaking hands. She caught his eye and managed a small, fierce smile. "If they come, they'll find more than easy prey." The rancher didn't smile back, but he felt something stir in his chest. A spark he thought had long since died. For the first time in years, he wasn't preparing to fight alone, and that made all the difference. The night fell heavy over the plains, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow sound as well as light. The rancher stood on the porch, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. The woman sat nearby, the revolver resting on the table beside her, though she kept glancing at it as if unsure whether it was friend or foe. For a long while, the land was quiet. The kind of quiet that stretched nerves thin. Then it came, a sound carried on the wind. Faint, broken, but unmistakable. Laughter. It wasn't the laughter of men warmed by drink or the laughter of children at play. It was jagged, cruel, the kind of sound that cut deep into bone. The woman stiffened, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The rancher's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He knew what it meant. The vultures were out there, circling, close enough to be heard but not seen. A half hour later, the first gunshot rang out. Far off, from the ridge beyond the pasture but close enough to echo across the land. Another followed. Then another. Random scattered shots not aimed at them but fired for show. The vultures weren't attacking yet. They were playing. The woman's hands shook. They're toying with us. The rancher's grip tightened on his rifle. That's their way. Wolves before the kill. They waited, tense and silent, but the night offered no comfort. When at last he rose to fetch more firewood, the stench hit him before his eyes did. By the fence line lay something dark and twisted. He strode closer, lantern swinging, and his stomach turned. A steer gutted from throat to belly, its entrails spread across the dirt like some macabre warning. The symbol, the jagged circle with 3 slashes, was carved deep into its hide. Its eyes were gone, gouged out, leaving only black holes staring at nothing. The woman followed, then froze when she saw. Her hand flew to her mouth, muffling the sob that threatened to break free. Tears welled, but she forced them back down, shaking her head in defiance. The rancher knelt by the carcass, lantern light glinting off the blood-slick flesh. His hands trembled as he touched the carved symbol, tracing its rough edges. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a message. We're here. We're watching. You're next. He rose, slow and heavy, his face hard as stone. They want to break us before the fight. They won't, she whispered, but her voice faltered. Back inside, he cleaned his rifle again, each motion stiff, mechanical. His fingers shook so badly the cloth slipped twice, nearly knocking the rifle to the floor. With a growl of frustration, he set it down and pressed his hands flat against the table, trying to will the tremors away. The woman sat across from him, studying his face. It's not the vultures that make you shake, she said softly. His eyes snapped up, sharp as steel, but she held his gaze. It's the past. You're fighting ghosts as much as men. He wanted to deny it, to snarl at her and tell her she knew nothing of him, but the words stuck in his throat. She was right. Every gunshot out there didn't just echo across the land, it echoed across his memories. White Hollow, the Navarro brothers, the flames that ate through homes while children screamed, the graves he dug with his own hands. His breaths came ragged, his vision blurred with ghosts. Then he felt her hand on his, small, warm, steady despite her own trembling. You're not the only one afraid, she whispered. I've lived with fear every day since they came. But I'm still standing. And so are you. Fear doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. And humans can fight. Her words sank into him like water into dry soil. He didn't answer, but his grip on the table eased. Slowly he picked up the rifle again, steadier this time. The tremor was still there, faint but bearable. The hours dragged on. From the hills came more laughter, more shots. Once the sound of hooves thundered close, so close the woman thought the attack had begun. But then the riders wheeled back, leaving only churned dirt and mocking silence. At midnight, another carcass was found. This time a dog, left at the edge of the porch, its head severed, placed upright on the steps as though it watched them with glassy eyes. The woman gagged, tears streaming freely now, but she didn't look away. The rancher kicked the remains into the darkness, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with rage. They'll keep this up until dawn, he muttered. They want us worn down, shaken, too scared to fight when the real storm hits. Then we don't give them what they want, the woman said, surprising herself with the firmness in her tone. We hold steady. The rancher studied her, and for the first time he saw more than desperation in her. He saw iron. They returned to the porch and sat in silence, side by side. The night played its cruel games, the cackles, the gunshots, the eerie silence between. But they endured. At one point, the woman dozed against the chair, revolver still clutched in her hand. The rancher watched her, his face softening in the lantern light. She was right. Fear hadn't broken her. She had buried her kin, fled her home, and faced horrors he wouldn't wish on anyone. And still she sat here ready to fight beside him. He looked down at his trembling hands. Perhaps courage wasn't the absence of fear. Perhaps it was carrying on in spite of it. Near dawn, the laughter faded. The last gunshot echoed and was gone. Silence fell, heavy and final. The rancher rose, stiff and weary, and looked out at the land. In the distance, along the ridge, faint lights flickered. Torches, dozens of them. The black vultures weren't playing anymore. They were coming. The first pale light of dawn spilled across the plains, painting the horizon in muted shades of pink and gray. Smoke from the smoldering carcasses drifted low over the fields, clinging to the earth like fog. The rancher stood at the fence line, his rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the ridge. There, against the rising sun, he saw them, the black vultures, a dozen riders, maybe more, their silhouettes jagged against the glow, torches burning in their fists. They moved slowly, not in haste, but with the cruel patience of predators savoring the hunt. Their laughter no longer echoed across the land. It was no longer necessary. Their message had already been carved into the night with blood and fire. Now they were here to finish it. The woman stepped up beside him, revolver clutched tight in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But there was no mistaking the resolve burning there. She had buried fear beneath something stronger. "They're coming," she whispered. He nodded once. His hands trembled as he gripped the rifle, but he didn't lower it. Instead, he let the tremor be. Fear would always be there. He had learned that much. What mattered was what he did with it. "They'll hit the barn first," he said. "Try to burn us out, flush us into the open. That's where we make our stand." Together they moved quickly. The traps they had laid were ready, pits hidden in the earth, ropes strung low across the paths. Barrels of water stood at the ready near the barn and house. Every preparation felt small, fragile against the storm bearing down on them, but it was all they had. The woman touched his arm. "Whatever happens, don't stop fighting." For a moment he saw her as he had the first night, ragged, desperate, whispering that they'd kill them all. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had found her steel, and in her defiance he found his. The vultures reached the pasture. Their torches waved high, flames snapping in the wind. One rider whooped and the others answered with shouts and jeers. They didn't charge, not yet. They wanted to show their power, to stretch the dread tight before the strike. The rancher leveled his rifle. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the land. His breath slowed, steady now. The tremor in his hands remained, but his aim was true. He whispered under his breath, "Not a prayer, but a promise. Not again. Not like White Hollow. This time it will mean something." The first shot cracked across the plains. One rider toppled from his horse, his torch tumbling into the grass. The vultures roared in fury, spurring their mounts into a charge. The ground shook with their advance, hooves pounding like thunder. The woman fired her revolver, the shot ringing sharp and wild. She missed, but she didn't falter. She cocked the hammer and fired again, her eyes blazing. The rancher squeezed his trigger, each bullet finding a target. The traps they had laid claimed others. Horses stumbled, throwing riders into the dirt, some skewered on sharpened stakes. But still they came. Torches arced through the air, crashing against the barn. Flames leapt along the dry wood, roaring to life in seconds. Smoke billowed, thick and choking. The rancher dropped his rifle long enough to grab a barrel of water, dousing the flames as the woman covered him with wild, frantic shots. Bullets whined past their heads, splintering wood and shattering glass. The rancher's world narrowed to fire, smoke, and the pounding in his chest. Every trigger pull was a battle, not just against the vultures, but against the ghosts clawing at his mind. White Hollow burned again in his memory, screams rising, bodies falling. For a heartbeat, he froze. Then he felt the woman's hand on his arm. "Stay with me," she shouted over the roar. Her voice cut through the smoke, through the ghosts. He gritted his teeth, raised his rifle, and fired. One vulture fell, then another. His fear remained, but it no longer ruled him. The fight raged on, brutal and relentless. The barn's roof collapsed in flames, sending sparks raining across the yard. The traps thinned the raiders, but more pressed forward. Horses screamed, men cursed, bullets tore into the earth at their feet. The woman took cover by a barrel, her revolver empty. She reloaded with shaking hands, her face streaked with soot, hair wild in the wind. When one rider veered toward her, pistol raised, she stood her ground. Her shot caught him in the chest, and he tumbled from the saddle. She stared at the smoking gun in her hands, shock flashing across her face. Then she lifted it again, ready for more. The rancher saw her, and pride swelled in his chest. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. The vultures, bloodied and burning, began to falter. Their jeers turned to shouts of rage, then fear. Some pulled back, spurred their mounts toward the hills, leaving their dead in the dirt. A few, mad with fury, pressed harder, but they fell to the rancher's unerring aim and the woman's defiant fire. At last, silence fell. Smoke hung heavy in the air. The barn a blackened husk, the ground littered with bodies. The surviving vultures scattered into the wilderness, their torches extinguished, their laughter silenced. The rancher lowered his rifle, chest heaving, sweat and soot streaking his face. His hand still trembled, but he felt the weight of it differently now. It was not weakness, it was proof that he had faced fear and stood. The woman staggered to his side, revolver still clutched in her blistered hand. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, but she smiled through the exhaustion. "We did it." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years something eased in his chest. Not joy, not peace, not yet, but a step toward it. "We stood," he said softly. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the ravaged land. Smoke still curled, and the air stank of blood and ash, but they were alive. The vultures had come, and the ranch had not fallen. The woman sank onto the porch steps, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Relief, grief, exhaustion all mingled. The rancher stood beside her, rifle in hand, staring out across the plains. The storm had passed. The ghosts remained. But for the first time in years, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt the weight of redemption.